The posting came through at 600, and nobody in the room bothered to lower their voice when they laughed. I was standing at the back of the briefing hall on Orbital Station Meridian, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, listening to Director Harlan Cole read my new assignment off a tablet like he was announcing a lunch order. Personal attaché, diplomatic protection detail, destination, Keth Dominion Embassy, Verk Station. Subject, Her Royal Highness, Princess Severath of the Keth Dominion. Duration, indefinite. The laughter was polite the way laughter at a funeral is polite. A few people covered their mouths. A few didn't bother. Cole set the tablet down. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, which was more than most would have managed. It's a visibility posting veil. The Keth requested a human liaison, someone presentable, low profile. Sure thing, I said. He waited for me to say something else. I didn't. You understand what this is, he said. I understood exactly what it was. A babysitting job wrapped in enough diplomatic language that nobody had to feel bad about it. The Keth Dominion was the third largest interstellar power in the known systems. They had technology that made our best ships look like folded paper. They had lived for centuries. They had fought wars that started before humans had figured out written language. And they had specifically requested, through 14 layers of diplomatic correspondence, a human liaison who was, and I am quoting the official Keth communique here, non-threatening in presence and appropriate in temperament. They wanted someone who wouldn't embarrass anyone. Cole had looked at the personnel files and found me. I finished the cold coffee, set the cup down, said, "When do I leave?" Verk Station was not impressive from the outside, which meant it was extremely impressive from the outside, because the Keth didn't believe in showing you everything at once. The docking bay alone was large enough to park 3 of Earth's carrier-class vessels with room left over. The lighting was low and amber. Everything smelled faintly of something I couldn't name, not unpleasant, just foreign, like walking into a house where different food had been cooked for 100 years. My escort was a Keth functionary named Veldran, who was approximately 7 feet tall, had 4 fingers on each hand, and looked at me the way you look at furniture you're not sure will fit through the door. He said my name wrong twice before we reached the end of the corridor. I didn't correct him. We passed 6 guard stations on the way to the reception hall. I counted the shift patterns, the spacing, the sightlines from each post to the next. Veldran was explaining the social protocols for meeting Princess Severath, how many degrees to bow, which hand to extend, what titles to use in which order. I nodded at the right moments. By the 4th guard station, I had already identified a gap. 14 seconds. Between the 3rd position guard completing his sweep and the 5th position guard picking up the corresponding angle. 14 seconds of open corridor with no visual coverage. It was probably nothing. I filed it. The reception hall was full of people who were very good at looking important. Keth dignitaries moved through the space like they owned it, which they did, in a cultural and literal sense simultaneously. There were a handful of human diplomatic staff along the far wall. I recognized 2 of them from previous postings, both of whom had the expression of people who had recently realized they were the least significant individuals in any given room and had made their peace with it. I stood where Veldran placed me, which was near the back, near a tall arrangement of something that was probably decorative and probably not a plant. And then the room shifted. Not visibly, not loudly. It was a pressure change, the way a room changes when someone walks in who everyone has been waiting for without admitting it. Princess Severath of the Keth Dominion entered from the left corridor. She was tall. Not Veldran tall, she was closer to 6 feet by human measurement, which made her relatively slight for Keth. Her skin was a deep, layered bronze that shifted color slightly under different angles of light, which I would later learn was a Keth biological feature called resonance stone, a minor thing, almost involuntary. Her eyes were pale and sharp in the way that things are sharp when they have been sharpened by a very long time. She was 212 years old. She looked at the room the way I looked at guard rotations. Veldran guided me forward. I executed the bow at the correct degrees, used the correct title in the correct order, extended the correct hand. I had memorized the protocols on the shuttle because I memorize things. That is what I do, but I let it look effortful. She looked at me. The look lasted exactly 3 seconds. I know because I counted. In those 3 seconds, she assessed me, categorized me, and placed me in whatever mental file she kept for non-threatening humans who had been sent to her as diplomatic courtesy. I watched her do it. She did not know I was watching. "You are the attaché they sent," she said. Her Terran was immaculate, better than most native speakers, with a faint precision that came from learning a language academically rather than growing up splashing around in its inconsistencies. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "You are the best they could send." I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere useful. "Yes, ma'am." She held my gaze for one more beat. Then she turned to speak with a Keth general on her left, and I ceased to exist in her immediate field of attention. I was fine with that. I went back to standing near the decorative non-plant and watching the crowd. There were 340 people in this hall. Most of them were exactly what they appeared to be. Most of them. Near the far entrance by the secondary corridor archway, there was a man in a Keth staff uniform. He was the right height for Keth staff. He was holding the right item, a service tray, the kind the catering functionaries carried. His posture was correct. His bearing was calm. His uniform stitching was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not wrong in a way you would catch unless you had spent a long time learning how wrong things hide inside right-looking things. The lateral seam on his left shoulder ran at 90 degrees to standard Keth construction. 2 extra centimeters of fabric bunched at the collar. Minor. Invisible if you weren't paying the right kind of attention. I was always paying the right kind of attention. I looked at him for exactly as long as I would look at any other catering staff. 2 seconds. Then I looked away. I did not go to the diplomatic staff. I did not approach the guard station. I did not signal anything to anyone. He didn't know I had seen him. That was worth more than any alarm. I picked up a glass of whatever was being served, stood near the wall, and spent the next 40 minutes being exactly as forgettable as everyone in this building needed me to be. Severath caught my eye once across the room briefly, while a Keth official was talking at her. The look said nothing specific. She was simply checking the position of staff the way you check the position of furniture, making sure everything was where it was supposed to be. I gave her the small nod of a man who was absolutely not a threat. She looked away. I looked back at the place where the man with the wrong-stitched uniform had been standing. He was gone. I had already noted the 3 directions he could have moved without crossing a guard line. I had already run the corridors in my head. I had already decided which one he had taken and why. I finished the drink, set the glass down. Someone had to do this job. I was glad it was me. By the 3rd day, I had mispronounced Severath's honorific title 4 times. The first time was genuine. The Keth language had a tonal element in the middle register that human vocal anatomy struggled with. The word for her rank required a sound that sat between 2 distinct pitches simultaneously, which was not something our mouths were built to do cleanly. I mangled it in front of Veldran, who closed his eyes in the particular way that very tall, very patient beings close their eyes when surrounded by inadequacy. The second time was a deliberate 5% improvement, just enough to look like I was trying. The 3rd and 4th times I got slightly worse, because I needed people to stop expecting me to get better. It was working. By day 3, the embassy staff had settled into a comfortable collective understanding of Marcus Vale. He was the human diplomatic attaché, earnest, slightly overwhelmed, endearing in the way that lost pets are endearing. He asked the wrong questions at briefings. He stood in the wrong position during formal processions. He referred to two separate Keth Council members by the wrong title, once each, and apologized with such genuine-looking distress that both of them had patted him on the shoulder in what I think was meant as comfort. Being underestimated is a skill. Most people think it happens to you. They are wrong. You build it, brick by brick. With the wrong fork at dinner and the over-earnest smile and the carefully timed moment where you write something down in your notebook that everyone in the room assumes is a reminder to bow at the correct angle next time. I was writing guard rotation times. Severath's personal security team ran a 16-point perimeter inside the embassy's inner sanctum. 6 Keth guards on rotating shifts, standard protocol for a visiting royal of mid-priority diplomatic status. The rotations were efficient. The gaps were small. There were 3 of them, and none of them were in places a standard threat would think to use. The man with the wrong-stitched uniform had not reappeared. He didn't need to. I knew he was still here because 2 things had changed since the reception. The service route for the Eastern Corridor catering staff had been subtly altered, by about 40 meters, in a way that made no logistical sense unless you were trying to avoid a specific camera angle. And one of the lower-level Keth administrative aides, a young functionary named Preth, had started taking his afternoon rest break in the same alcove every day at the same time, which was the kind of deliberate routine that people establish when they are waiting for a signal, not when they are simply tired. Preth, young, nervous in the specific way that people are nervous when they are involved in something they have not yet decided if they regret. I had not looked at Preth directly more than twice. On the 5th day, General Korvath invited me to a private briefing lunch. General Korvath was Severath's senior military advisor. He was enormous in the way that careers built entirely on the confidence of being right make a person enormous, not just physically, though he was that too, but in the amount of space he assumed he was entitled to occupy. He had commanded 3 campaigns across 2 star systems. He wore his rank the way some people wear their faces, completely naturally without thinking about it, unable to imagine themselves without it. He thought I was funny. Not funny as in amusing. Funny as in the way a child's drawing of a house is funny to an architect. Affectionate condescension dressed in the clothes of hospitality. Lunch was in a side chamber off the main council wing. There were 4 other Keth officers present. The food was served on flat, dark plates that I was later told were made from a mineral found only in the Keth home system. I ate what I was given and complimented it sincerely, because it was actually excellent, and sometimes the most disarming thing you can do is mean it. Korvath began speaking about humanity approximately 7 minutes in. He did it the way people begin speaking about a topic they have been thinking about for longer than the conversation, with a warm-up sentence that sounds like a tangent but isn't. Your people have accomplished remarkable things, he said, which is the sentence powerful people use when they mean the opposite of remarkable. I agreed pleasantly. He talked about human biology, our skeletal density, which was lower than Keth by roughly 30%. Our lifespan, which was between 1/5 and 1/4 of theirs. Our cognitive processing under high-stress conditions, which various Keth neurological studies had measured as comparatively limited. He was not cruel about it. He was precise in the way that makes cruelty unnecessary, because precision at that level carries its own weight. The other officers listened with the comfortable ease of people, hearing a familiar thesis confirmed. I listened with the full attention of a man who was deeply interested in everything being said. I agreed with 3 of his points. I asked one clarifying question, slightly incorrect, just enough to confirm his expectations. I laughed at the right moment. I refilled his glass. He was standing 40 centimeters from the position I had already identified as the primary corridor access point for the Eastern Service route. In 6 minutes, if my read on Preth's timing was correct, someone would pass that corridor carrying information to the man with the wrong-stitched uniform, and I was sitting in the only room with a sightline to the relevant junction, and nobody in this room thought I was worth looking at. I agreed with Korvath's final point about human resilience being admirable in its limitations. He smiled, satisfied. 5 minutes and 50 seconds later, Preth walked past the junction with a service envelope tucked into his left sleeve. I watched him. He didn't see me watching, because I was nodding at something Korvath was saying and looking at a point approximately 2 degrees to the right of where I was actually looking. Third contact. Now I had the shape of it. 2 individuals I'd identified, 1 courier I could now confirm. Still 1 unknown, the coordinator, the person who wasn't moving, wasn't carrying, wasn't doing anything visible, just waiting. I had the where, I had approximate numbers, I needed the when. That night I ran the outer perimeter of the embassy grounds. 14 kilometers. Dark. I did it in 43 minutes because the ground was slightly uneven near the eastern wall, and I didn't want to turn an ankle on someone else's operation timeline. I came back in through the maintenance access I had identified on day 1, changed clothes, and was sitting in my quarters writing a diplomatic summary of General Korvath's lunch commentary. Genuinely, because it was genuinely useful, when someone knocked at my door. It was Severath. Not Veldran, not a staff functionary, her. She was not in formal attire. She wore something that was probably the Keth equivalent of casual clothing, which still looked more deliberate and structured than anything I owned. She had a data slate in her hand, and an expression on her face that was doing something complicated that I hadn't seen from her before. "You were not in your quarters an hour ago," she said. Not a question. "No, ma'am." "Where were you?" I considered the available answers. "Walking," I said. She looked at me the way she had looked at the empty doorway on the second day, when I had been standing in it with the wrong expression and then left too fast. Something behind her eyes was working on a problem. "Why did you take this posting?" she asked. Quiet, careful. Not the question a princess asks in a cliché. The question a person asks someone they have started to suspect they do not understand. I met her eyes, held them for exactly as long as was appropriate and no longer. "Someone had to," I said. She waited for the rest of the sentence. It didn't come. She looked at the slate in her hand, then back at me, said nothing else, turned and walked back down the corridor with the controlled, even stride of someone who was not going to let me know that the answer had stayed with her. I closed my door. Outside, somewhere in the eastern wing, Preth was sleeping, or pretending to. The man with the wrong stitching was still in the building. The coordinator was still invisible. The wind was getting close. I could feel it the way you feel weather changing, not in the air, in the pressure behind it. I made 2 small notes, put them inside the notebook that everyone thought contained bow-angle reminders. Set my internal clock for 4 hours and went to sleep. The gala announcement came on the 7th day. A formal state reception, honoring the 6th anniversary of the Kethterra diplomatic accords. 260 guests, dignitaries from 6 Kethaline systems, 4 neutral territories, and a delegation of 8 humans representing Earth's diplomatic corps. Full formal dress, full ceremonial protocol. The kind of event where the flowers cost more than most people's annual earnings and everyone in the room is performing a version of themselves. Severath would stand at the center of it for 4 hours. I read the itinerary twice, closed it, opened my notebook. The gala was the when. I didn't need to prove it. I could feel the geometry of it. The crowd density would reduce visibility to any guard not specifically positioned for the interior. The formal lighting configuration, which I had reviewed in the venue layout under the pretense of checking accessibility for human guests, created 3 shadow pockets along the main hall's northern side. A large, loud, formally structured event was exactly the kind of environment that swallowed disturbances before anyone knew to look for them. I had 3 contacts identified, 1 coordinator still invisible, 1 gap in the rotation I had mapped, 1 14-second window in the eastern access corridor. I had 1 more day to find the 4th person. The morning before the gala, I managed to walk into a potted arrangement in the front reception atrium. It was a magnificent plant, tall, structured with wide flat leaves that were a deep and dignified purple. It had done nothing to deserve me. I hit it with my shoulder, caught the container with both hands before it fell, and then knocked a small side table with my elbow, which sent a decorative sphere rolling across the polished floor with a sound like a formal complaint. 2 Keth staff members watched this happen. One of them covered their mouth. I gathered the sphere, replaced it, apologized to the plant quietly, which was not part of any plan but simply felt appropriate. Then I walked to the morning briefing with my jacket slightly crooked. At the briefing, a Keth Council aide named Savrath spent 11 minutes explaining to me, in the helpful tone of someone who wants you to know they are not judging you, that the upcoming gala had a specific movement protocol for non-Keth attendees. I would need to stay within a designated observation area near the eastern wall during the formal address portion. I would need to avoid direct eye contact with visiting dignitaries above a certain rank, as this was considered, in Keth social architecture, presumptuous. I wrote all of this down. Savrath watched me write it and nodded with quiet satisfaction. I was writing the access points for the northern wall's service corridor. That afternoon, General Korvath found me in the common reading room. He was alone, which was unusual. He sat across from me without asking, in the large, settled way of someone for whom sitting wherever they wish has simply never been a problem. "Tomorrow will be significant," he said. "It sounds like a wonderful event," I said. He looked at me with something that was close to warmth and close to pity in equal measure, the way you might look at someone who has no idea that the card they're holding is not a winning hand. "Your species," he said, "has always impressed me with your enthusiasm. You embrace these occasions as if the ceremony itself is the substance." I considered the flat of the table between us. "We don't have as much time as you do," I said. "We learn to take the occasion seriously." He tilted his head, considering that. "Yes," he said slowly, "I suppose that is one way of seeing it." He was kind enough to make it sound like he thought it was a reasonable perspective, which is different from agreeing. He talked for another 20 minutes, about human neurology under stress, about the comparative pain threshold studies that various Keth institutions had conducted during the early contact period. Humanely, he was careful to note, all voluntary, which confirmed that humans operated near their cognitive and physical ceiling far sooner than Keth under equivalent conditions. Soft species, he called it, not unkindly. A classification, not an insult. I nodded, asked a question about the methodology of one of the studies, slightly incorrect, which gave him the pleasure of correcting me gently. While he talked, I watched the reflection in the darkened window panel to his left. In the corridor behind me, a figure walked past. Not fast, not slow, carrying nothing. But the walk was wrong, not the walk of someone going somewhere, the walk of someone checking whether something was in position. It was not Preth, not the wrong-stitched uniform, someone knew. The coordinator was not invisible anymore. I had all 4 of them. I kept my eyes on Korvath and listened to him explain the physical limitations of short-lived species, with every appearance of a man who was learning something useful. He finished and stood, placed one large hand briefly on my shoulder in a gesture I had seen him use with junior Keth staff, approving, paternal, slightly condescending in the kindest possible way. "Enjoy the gala tomorrow," he said. "It will be quite an experience for you." Sure thing, I said. That evening, Severath's preparation for the gala was in progress in the formal wing. I could hear the distant movement of staff, the low sound of Veldran issuing instructions. The embassy had the particular busy quiet of a building where everyone is working toward the same event and has been for days. I went to my quarters. I did not sleep. I spent 3 hours in the kind of stillness that people who have never needed it would mistake for doing nothing. I was running the room in my head, the coordinator's position, the wrong-stitched man's likely entry point, the 14-second window, Preth's role courier, not active, which meant he would be somewhere safe and peripheral when it happened, which told me he was a secondary layer, not a primary one. 2 active, 1 coordinator position for oversight and signal, 1 unknown factor I had not fully placed. I did not like unknown factors. I ran the geometry again and again. At midnight, I ate something from the food supply in my quarters, drank water, did a set of movements in the small space available, not exercise exactly, more like a reminder to my body that everything was still working and ready to work harder on request. Then I sat by the door and waited for morning. The lights went out at 21:14. Not all of them. The backup amber strip stayed on, which is what they were designed to do, which is what someone had counted on when they chose 21:14, because the amber light was enough to see by and not enough to see well by. And in the gap between those two things, a lot of decisions could be made that nobody would be able to track clearly afterward. I was already moving. Not towards Severath. I knew where she was center of the main hall, 20 feet from the formal address platform, surrounded by enough Keth dignitaries that the ambient social pressure alone would have kept her stationary for 30 seconds while people processed what was happening. 30 seconds is a very long time. I moved left, into the dark, along the northern wall, inside the shadow pocket I had memorized from the layout diagram 3 days ago, moving with my right hand trailing the wall at exactly the height I had pre-calculated. Because when you cannot rely on your eyes, you rely on everything you measured before your eyes became unreliable. The first sound I heard behind me was a soft impact, which was one of Severath's guards going down. Professional. Fast. No alarm raised, which told me these people had done this before and done it well. I turned the northern corner. The corridor ahead had 3 possible positions where someone could stand and cover the main hall entrance and the eastern access simultaneously. I had run this in my head. I knew which one I would use. He was in the second one. Not the first, not the third. The second, which was also the one I would have used, which told me something about the person who had planned this, that they were good at it. I did not stop moving. I did not announce myself. I did not give him the breadth of time that he would have used to make a decision. He made a sound, then he stopped making sounds. I kept moving. The eastern corridor was 11 seconds away at a pace that would not sound like running to someone listening from the hall. I did it in 9. The wrong-stitched man was at the junction. He had a device in his hand, not a weapon, a signal relay, the kind that blocks specific communication frequencies in a 40-meter radius. He was looking toward the hall. He was very focused on the hall. He heard me at 4 feet. He turned at 3. By 2, it was already resolved. I left him sitting against the wall. He would live. He would have questions later when he was capable of questions. The relay device was no longer functioning. I turned back toward the hall. The hall was moving, not panicking, moving, the controlled surge of bodies trying to organize themselves in low light. Severath's remaining guards had formed a close perimeter around her. I could see the formation from the corridor entrance. 4 guards, correct spacing, correct angles, which meant they were still intact and functioning, and she was inside a reasonable protective structure. Then the formation shifted. 1 guard turned inward, not outward where threats come from, Inward, which is the direction you turn when the threat is already inside the thing you're protecting. I counted 2 steps through the hall entrance. Preth was not a courier. I had been wrong about Preth. He was past the outer guard line before they tracked him. Because he was known, he had clearance. He had spent 7 days being a familiar face in the correct places, which is exactly the kind of placement that works until it stops working. He had 4 feet of ground between himself and Severath. He had 3 feet. I came through the guard line from the wrong direction, which is to say the direction nobody was watching because nobody expected anyone to come from it, and I crossed the space between us in the time it takes to exhale. Preth had 2 feet. He had 1. He had a hand reaching forward. Then he had nothing because I had him, and having him meant the reach stopped and the ground came up, and the situation resolved in a direction that was not the one he had planned. He went down. Not gently, but alive. I stepped back. I was breathing, working at it but breathing. My ribs had opinions about the last 4 minutes. I noted the opinions and set them aside. The amber light caught the faces nearest to me. Guards, dignitaries, staff, some of them in the corner positions, frozen the way people freeze when something has moved faster than their understanding of how fast things move. And Severath. She was standing exactly where her guard formation had placed her, unhurt, still. Her pale eyes had found me and they were not moving. I straightened my jacket. The wrong fork from dinner 3 nights ago was still on my lapel. I had not bothered to remove it because it was useful to be the kind of man who forgets to remove a wrong fork. I thought about removing it now. I left it where it was. "Sorry about the mess," I said. My voice was level. I was pleased about that. She did not respond. She was looking at me the way you look at something you have picked up to examine and discovered weighs twice what you expected. Veldran was speaking into a communication device. The backup systems were coming up, full lighting returning in stages, white replacing amber, the room reassembling itself under bright light into something that looked more like the formal event it had been 40 seconds ago and less like a tactical situation. The 4 contacts were down or contained. The signal relay was disabled. The perimeter was intact. Severath was unhurt. The gala was, by most measures, a ruin. By the measures that mattered, it had ended correctly. A Keth guard moved toward me with a hand up. Not aggressive, cautious. The gesture of someone who has just watched something they don't have a category for and wants to establish where I fit in the new order of things. I showed him my diplomatic credentials. He looked at them, looked at me, looked at the credentials again. "Attaché," he said, reading the title. "Yes," I said. He did not know what to do with that. The lights finished coming up. The hall was fully lit now. 300 guests in formal attire standing in the kind of silence that follows something nobody had a preparation for. And in the center of it, Severath. She had not moved. She was still looking at me with that same waitry assessment expression. Around her, aides were moving, guards were repositioning. Veldran was issuing low, rapid instructions into his communication device. The machinery of response was engaging. She stood in the middle of all of it and looked at me. I looked back. In Keth, not her public Keth, not the formal register she used for addresses, but the lower, quieter register that I had heard her use once briefly. When she thought she was speaking only to Veldran, she said, "What are you?" The hall was too noisy for most people to have heard it. I heard it. I thought about the answer for a moment. It was a fair question, and it deserved a real answer, which is different from a full answer. "Your attaché," I said, "ma'am." She looked at the wrong fork on my lapel. She looked back at my face. Something moved behind her eyes that I could not fully read, which was unusual, because I was usually fairly good at reading things. Then Veldran was at her side and the room was moving around both of us, and I stepped back into the managed chaos of a gala that had become an incident, and I let the machinery take over, because that is when you let the machinery take over, after the part that machinery cannot do has already been done. The debrief room smelled like recycled air and defensiveness. 9 Keth military officers, 3 members of Severath's senior diplomatic staff, 2 representatives from Earth's consular office, both of whom looked like men who had been woken up from a sound sleep and had not forgiven anyone for it yet. Veldran, standing at the back with the expression of someone rearranging everything they thought they knew about a situation they had managed daily for a week. And me sitting at the end of a table that was slightly too large for the room, with a cup of coffee that was actually hot this time, which I appreciated. The lead debriefer was a Keth security commander named Harith, compact for Keth, which still meant substantial, with the kind of methodical patience that comes from a career spent getting complete answers. He had asked me 4 questions so far. I had answered all 4 completely and without elaboration. He asked the 5th, "When did you identify the primary contact?" "The reception," I said, "first night." The room shifted, not physically, in temperature. Harith kept his face level. "The reception was 7 days ago." "Yes." "You identified a threat actor 7 days ago and reported nothing to our security office." "Correct." Across the table, one of the Earth consular representatives, a man named Jeffrey Crane, who had the look of someone who had built a career on avoiding exactly this kind of room, opened his mouth. I looked at him briefly and he closed it again. "Explain your reasoning," Harith said. I set down the coffee. One identified contact is a concern. One identified contact tells you almost nothing useful. Who sent him? How many others? What the timeline is. Alerting your security office at that stage gets you one detained individual who knows he's been identified, which means everyone else in the network goes dark and repositions. You lose the whole picture for the sake of one piece. You chose to wait. I chose to gather information until I had enough of it to act on usefully. Yes. Silence the considered kind. Harith asked, "When did you identify all 4 contacts?" "The afternoon before the gala. The coordinator was the last. I had the other 3 by day 5. 4 individuals," Harith said. "Over 6 days, with no access to our surveillance systems, no security clearance above diplomatic tier, and no formal training designation in your current posting." "Correct." "What is your formal training designation?" I took a sip of coffee, diplomatic attaché. Harith looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at his file. Then he looked back at me, and there was something in his expression that was not quite the careful professional neutrality he had been operating with for the last 40 minutes. He asked 3 more questions about the specific tactical sequence of the night before. I answered them. He wrote notes. His pen moved slower as the answers went on, the way a pen slows when the hand holding it is thinking harder than the writing requires. The Keth officer to Harith's left, younger, one of the security staff who had been on duty during the gala, leaned forward. "You identified the gap in the guard rotation. Our rotation." "Yes." "How?" "Day 2, I said. I counted the transition times during the morning shift change. The 5th position guard runs a 3-second longer sweep than the 3rd position guard compensates for. It creates a 14-second window in the eastern corridor." The young officer looked at the senior officer to his right. The senior officer had the expression of a man discovering that a window in his house had been open for 7 days. "That gap," the senior officer said quietly, "has been in our standard rotation for 4 years. "I know," I said. "They knew it too." That landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. The outward movement of it reached every face. Harith closed his file, opened it again, closed it. I have a final question. All right. Why did you not inform Princess Severath directly, at any point, if you had information about a credible threat to her safety? She would have changed her behavior, I said. Severath is exceptional at this. I meant it as a statement of fact and delivered it that way. If she had known someone was watching her security detail for gaps, she would have been more careful. Her increased caution would have been visible to anyone already watching. It would have changed their timeline and moved them somewhere I couldn't predict. You kept her unaware to keep her safe, Harith said. Yes. She was not pleased when I informed her of that reasoning this morning, he said. No, I said, I wouldn't expect her to be. He studied me. She has filed a formal request to retain your posting, indefinitely, as of this morning. He said it with the flatness of someone delivering information they are still processing themselves. In 40 years of managing her diplomatic staff, she has never filed such a request for any individual of any species. I looked at the coffee cup. All right, I said. 3 days after the debrief, the embassy returned to something resembling its normal operation. The arrested individuals were in Keth custody. Preth had confirmed the involvement of a minor factional group within one of the 6 system delegations, not a major political operation, which was almost worse in a way, because minor factional groups were less predictable than the organized kind. Harith's office was handling the follow-up investigation. My cooperation with that process consisted of sitting in 2 additional meetings and answering questions with the same completeness I had brought to the first. Verk Station, to its credit, did not treat me differently in any visible way. The same staff walked the same corridors. Veldran still mispronounced my name, though I noticed he had begun correcting himself partway through, which was not something he had done before. The decorative non-plant in the atrium was still there. Someone had moved it slightly, possibly to reduce the collision hazard it represented. I still walked into it on the 4th morning, out of respect. Severath did not call me in to speak with her on the 1st day, or the 2nd. I did not expect her to. There is a specific kind of conversation that needs to be handled the right distance from the events that made it necessary, and she was precise enough to know the right distance. She called me on the 4th evening. The formal wing, her private meeting room, which was smaller than any of the public spaces I had seen her occupy, and correspondingly more like a room where a person actually existed rather than performed. There was a wide window looking out over the station's outer dock, the amber glow of the berth lights, the dark geometry of docked ships, the far stars doing what they always did, which was nothing, beautifully. She was standing at the window when I came in. Veldran closed the door behind me. She turned. She was in the not quite casual clothing again, which I had come to understand was her version of a human removing their jacket, not undressed, but the version of herself she wore when the performance had a smaller audience. She looked at me for a moment. Sit down, she said. I sat. She remained standing, which was not a power choice. She was a person who thought better on her feet. I had noticed this about her by day 3. She moved to a chair and then didn't sit in it, leaned against it instead with one hand on the back. I have spoken to your consular office, she said. They provided your full service record. A pause. The unredacted version. The consular office doesn't have the unredacted version, I said. I know, she said. I contacted a different office. I looked at her, she looked at me. How long, she said, before you came to this posting, were you doing the kind of work you did 4 nights ago? 11 years, but I said, long enough to be useful at it. Why did you stop? I didn't. She absorbed that. Her pale eyes moved over my face with the slow, careful attention of someone reading something in a language they are mostly fluent in but still have to work at. You presented yourself as incompetent, she said. Yes. Deliberately. Yes. For 7 days in front of my entire staff, my guards, my advisors. She was not angry, she was working through something. You let Corvath lecture you about the limitations of your species for 40 minutes. He had accurate data about human biology, I said. Most of what he said was correct. It did not bother you. People have been underestimating humans since we first appeared in space. We've had a long time to get comfortable with it. She moved away from the chair, walked 3 steps toward the window and then turned back. I underestimated you. Yes, ma'am. From the first moment. Yes, ma'am. She looked at the floor for a moment, and I thought she was going to say something about that directly. She didn't. She said, "Is that what you intended when you answered that you were the best they could send?" I thought about the reception, her 3-second assessment, the file she had placed me in. "I intended for you to believe whatever was most useful," I said. "At the reception, that was whatever you already thought. And now it's useful for you to know what I actually am." She turned and looked at the window, the dock lights, the stars. "What did you think," she said quietly, "when Corvath told you that humans were soft, that your lives were short and your bodies were limited?" It was a real question. I considered it as a real question deserves. "I thought he was right," I said, "and I thought he didn't understand what right means in that context." She looked back. "We are soft," I said. "Shorter lives, lower density, higher pain sensitivity, smaller comparative physical load. All of that is accurate. What Corvath doesn't know, because it isn't in any of the studies he cited, is what happens to a species that lives with those limitations for long enough." I paused. "You get very good at making the most of what you have. You stop wasting time on the things that don't matter because you don't have extra time. You learn to read a room faster because you have fewer chances to get a room wrong. You learn patience the way you learn a language when you need it to survive, not theoretically, practically." She was very still. 14 seconds, I said. "The gap in your guard rotation. I found it in 2 days because I grew up in a world where a 14-second gap is the kind of thing you either find or regret not finding. Your guards have 4-year rotations and your station has been secure for decades, and that's why they missed it. Not because they're less capable. Because security without repeated consequence becomes a habit, and habits stop seeing gaps." The room was quiet for a long time. She said, "You mispronounced my honorific all week." "Yes, ma'am." "You knew the correct pronunciation." "From day one," I said. "It's in the diplomatic briefing materials, 4 different audio guides." "Then why?" "Because a man who can't manage the honorific title is not a man anyone watches carefully." She looked at the wrong fork on my lapel. I had kept it there. After everything, I had kept it there. Her expression shifted slightly. Not a smile, Keth facial expression did not work exactly the way human expression worked, and what moved across her face was subtler and faster, and I could not fully name it. But there was something in it that was not the assessment look, and not the Waitree assessment look, and not any of the several diplomatic masks I had cataloged in the past 7 days. Something that was closer to simply real. "You came here," she said, "knowing there was a threat. Suspecting. The consular office didn't send you because of a suspected threat." "No," I agreed. "They sent me because they needed a non-threatening presence of appropriate temperament." "So you knew something they didn't." I knew someone had worked very hard on the specific wording of that request. The language in a diplomatic communique tells you as much about what the sender is afraid of as about what they want. The phrasing, non-threatening, applied to a diplomatic liaison request was unusual. It told me the sender had reason to think a threatening presence was a real possibility. And I knew the kind of posting that looks like a joke is sometimes the posting that needs the most careful person. She was quiet again. Then someone had to. She was repeating what I had said to her 9 days ago in the corridor outside my quarters. Yes, I said. And you chose to be that someone. Yes, ma'am. She looked at me with the full weight of 212 years. I held it the way I had learned to hold things that were heavier than they looked, steadily, without performance, letting the weight be what it was. You are going to continue mispronouncing the honorific, she said. I considered this. For a while, I said, until I have a feel for who is still watching. There are still threats. There are always still threats. That's what the job is. She looked at me for a long moment. The dock lights shifted outside the window, a ship moving out of berth, the slow yellow arc of its running lights crossing the glass and then fading. The debrief established, she said, that you neutralized 3 contacts in under 4 minutes in near darkness, having sustained no prior injury and carrying no designated equipment. The 4th wasn't a neutralization, I said. Preth was contained. He'll walk fine in a month. Contained, she said. Tasting the distinction, you pulled your force. He was scared and badly used by people who understood his situation was difficult. That's different from someone who chose this. She looked at the window again. When she spoke, her voice was lower. Korvath came to me this morning. He wanted to discuss revising certain assumptions in the Keth assessment framework for human diplomatic personnel. I kept my face level. He was, she said, remarkably humble about it. He's a good man, I said. He'll update. Will you accept the extended posting? You filed the request 3 days ago, I said. A beat. You knew. Harith told me in the debrief, and yes, I'll accept it. She pushed off the window ledge, walked back to the chair, and this time sat in it, properly, the way someone sits when they are done standing at a careful distance. You will, she said, continue to maintain the cover of general incompetence. As long as it's useful. And the wrong fork. Useful tool. The corner of her mouth moved. I have 212 years of practice, she said, reading people. I know, I said. You are, she said, significantly harder to read than anything I have encountered in those 212 years. I thought about that. Short lives, I said. We learn not to waste the time we have. You get very efficient. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she rose, and the meeting was over in the precise, clean way that her meetings always ended. Not dramatically, just finished. The way a door closes on a conversation that had said its necessary things. At the door I paused. Ma'am. She looked back. The rotation gap in the eastern corridor, I said. I gave Harith a revised recommendation. 12 position with a 2-second offset stagger. It'll eliminate the window. She nodded once, the nod of someone filing a thing accurately. I left. In the corridor outside, Veldran was waiting. He looked at me with the new expression he had been wearing since the gala, still careful, still professionally composed, but recalibrated. The furniture had turned out to weigh twice what was expected, and he was adjusting for it. Marcus Vale, he said, correctly both syllables, correct emphasis. First time in 7 days. Sure thing, I said. I walked back down the corridor toward the east wing to run the new rotation check. Short lives, we learned to make the time count. I had learned better than most.